Delighted to be here and have really been enjoying the talks of my fellow panelists. As someone who works at the intersection of social media research and digital humanities, who got started in DH writing about national digital libraries, I feel like this actually could be part of a coherent conversation. What does that mean in terms of thinking about questions of digital humanities and research ethics, which is the topic of my discussion. So I'm often working with corpora where there are complicated ethical issues. So for example, something like the Trump Twitter archive with its 50,000 tweets. It's not just the expressions of Donald J. Trump. He's also retweeting content. So there are people whose materials have been included into the corpus of his Twitter archive that did not consent to be there. Similarly, of course, working with something like the Hillary Clinton email archive, in which the materials were actually stolen from the participants by a hacker, you have these kind of complicated ethical questions about when and how to use these materials and how to understand them as part of digital humanities. And so my talk today is intended as a kind of provocation, thinking about what we can do as a professional organization to go beyond just thinking about codes of conduct for our scholarly communities. And I know a lot of, I see people in the room who've worked on the codes of conduct for ADHO, and I think that's important labor. But I also think that perhaps discussion of research ethics in digital communities is an under-articulated area. Although I would point out that at this conference, the folks who were part of the responsible data set in context yesterday, or the group talking about using AI ethically today, I think that there is certainly a conversation going on about research ethics in digital humanities. The question is, what can we do to have a kind of more coherent scholarly literature around this topic? And I think we can look to other kinds of professional organizations to think about how they're thinking about research ethics involving the digital. And one organization that I think it's interesting to look at is AIR, the Association of Internet Researchers, where their ethics guidelines are really shaped by ideas about harm reduction, informed consent, the principle of care, and reciprocity. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can perhaps learn from these other ways to talk about ethics by looking at other organizations. But I'd start by drawing from my own experience working with my collaborator, Kat Tietberg, at Tallinn University, where we co-taught a course on research ethics for media studies graduate students. And in particular, and Tietberg works on visual media like Tumblr. She's written a book about sex and social media. So as you can see from, this is her graphic, right? She's interested in questions about anonymity, privacy, social sorting, surveillance, norms, and judgment and shaping. So what does that mean for us in the digital humanities when we're thinking about questions of visibility, power, and justice? And I want to kind of zoom in to this part of, and after all, with the Kamala Harris thing, I think we all have to love Venn diagrams, right? So, diving into the Venn diagrams here today. So we can talk about DH in connection with transparency. And so when we talk about transparency, we're dealing with the question of people who have both privilege and power and who are avoiding visibility, right? So there is material that is secret, that needs to be made transparent to the broader public so that these architectures of the intersections of privilege and power are not maintained. Similarly, we can think about people who don't hold privilege and power, who are hypervisible, who are subject to the surveillance of the state and other kinds of bad actors that decrease their autonomy and purpose. So what does that mean if we look at some just sample DH projects and sort of think about this question of visibility, transparency, and exposure, and what DH can do when it comes to these questions of power and privilege. So for example, Lev Manovich's 2014 project, The Exceptional and the Everyday, 144 Hours in Kyiv, which is scraping from Instagram around the geographical area of the Maidan Revolution and sort of pulling in a lot of material that is directly related to the protests in the square, but also material that's not necessarily directly related, but is hashtag just happens to be geolocated. Now, things did not go according to Vladimir Putin's plan, right? Kyiv did not end up being seized, but this project, which was done in 2014 in a time of relative calm, could have potentially put some of these subjects in danger. So that there are ways that the activities of digital humanities research, because of the unpredictability of authoritarian regimes, might put human subjects in danger that we don't necessarily assume will be in danger, given the time in which we are actually assembling the corpus. Now, I think it's interesting to think about projects like Torn Apart Separados from 2018, which was looking at human rights abuses related to the separation of families at the border, and how initially asking questions about people's safety and kinship relationships in volume 1 actually became a project about transparency in volume 2, where it was looking at the ways that different entities actually benefit from ICE and other organizations that are connected to the incarceration and deportation of migrants. So I think that there are ways that even in the lifetime of a digital humanities project, you see a kind of movement around how that orientation around visibility, transparency, and exposure functions over time. And third, I think it's interesting to look at cases where there is private medical information or sexual information that might be obfuscated in certain ways. In the case of Kim Knight's Danger Jane Roe from 2015, she talks about it as a data visceralization, and she was sort of talking about it before the book Data Feminism came out, but obviously there was a larger discussion about data visceralization in our field. This question of like, how do we think about kinds of user experience that aren't necessarily controlled by the visual. She writes, calls into question the very notion of an objective and efficient transmission of information. So here she's, representing these pro-life tweets, sort of potentially part of the public record, but they're being represented in terms of wearable computing and this Arduino object. So what does this mean in terms of the ways that we train graduate students, that we talk about these intersections of privilege, power, and visibility? What does it mean for our community in terms of how we talk about these things? Let's look at another example, which is from the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, where the Intersectional Feminist DH Summer Institute, which I've been involved in co-teaching on and off again for various, almost a decade. I co-taught with Jessica Marie Johnson 1 year, and she really felt like Simone Brown's Dark Matters was essential reading for digital humanities students. How many of you are familiar with this book? I'm seeing a few hands shoot up. And it was the chapter actually on lantern laws that she thought was really important for digital humanities students to read, which is a chapter where Brown is talking about how people of color were required to carry lanterns. So they weren't allowed to control their own visibility at night, right? They had to be visible. And she wanted these digital humanities students to kind of think about the question of, how we think about people's desire to control their own visibility in the past as well as in our present. And I'll talk a little bit about this kind of tendency, the kind of tendency to assume that concerns about visibility are only those in the present when we think about digital humanities work. Now, of course, this is in teaching this, co-teaching this summer institute. Johnson also pointed to how some digital humanities projects, because they are often archiving acts of racial violence that are recorded in white media, can be difficult and harmful even in terms of generational trauma around extrajudicial violence on the Black body. And she was kind of looking specifically at the ways that some digital humanities projects might cause harm and not really understand the nature of that harm. And I think this is a really interesting site to look at because the creators have actually tried to do a lot to mitigate and work around potential harms, and yet there are still ways that the interventions could be seen as not enough. That for family members of these people who died so violently, to be exposed to accounts of those deaths in white newspapers is not necessarily something that is productive in terms of their experience. And of course, as she's worked on the question of who owns Black data, right, these questions about potential consequences of DH projects are ones that Johnson has continued to explore. So how do we think about DH projects and their potential consequences for human subjects? And how do we be sensitive to issues? And these have actually come up in several of the sessions I've attended at this conference, right? Non-consensual disclosures of private, financial, medical, psychological, sexual, and kinship information, legal liability and vulnerability to state power, and again, that's something that can be in flux. Reputational harms, including misgendering and misracing. This came up in a couple of the panels yesterday. Appropriating sacred knowledge, appropriating intellectual property, for example, small feminist presses that might be, the books might be out of print, but there still might be ways that actually reproducing those material without the consent of the original publishers and authors can be seen as doing harms, and exploiting generational trauma, as I mentioned before. And this is something, we started the session by talking about kind of violence to the archive. Rupika Rassam has written a lot about the violence of the archive, the ways that the archive itself can do violence, and how we think about the digital cultural record and its capacity to do harm. And this is also something that is reflected in the work of Moira Bailey, talking about community-informed consent, and this question of, like, what does informed consent mean? Is it just about the individual? So to give a few examples from my campus, this is documenting the LGBTIQ past in Virginia. It's a collection that's primarily oriented around oral histories of queer Virginians, but it also includes ephemera gathered from gay bars, student demonstrations, and different kinds of paper ephemera. What's complicated about this archive is that some of the informants in the archive might be out, but the people that they're talking about are not out. And so there's this potential for disclosure that's not consensual. So I think that there are certain kind of complications about that archive. What's interesting is that they're also looking at the ways that, say, things like alcohol licensing boards have also had a role in sort of controlling queer Virginians. So they're sort of trying to look at how these different discourses can give us a larger and more complex picture of the past. I think another potential harm that digital humanities projects can create is actually disappointment. I don't think we talk enough about the harm of disappointment that can be caused by a digital humanities project. So at William & Mary, we have 3 different related projects that have to do with reparative work related to Black community members who have continued to engage with the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow and the harms that were done to those communities. And that there is often hope that people will find information about ancestors through a digital humanities project. And when that hope is not fulfilled, there's often kind of a tendency for researchers not to engage sufficiently with the disappointment of that community. So for example, in Williamsburg, there were a variety of projects where people who knew that they had kin who had been enslaved in colonial Williamsburg were trying to find evidence about the lives of those family members. And both forensic science and oral histories had not really brought, and the written record had not really brought them the results that they did. Similarly, I think we also need to think, when we're thinking about power, privilege, and visibility, the ways that powerful interests might want to control the narrative of a digital humanities project, and how, if you want to have access to those records to work with, as in the case of the Georgian Papers program, which, you know, it's a huge trove of material involved with the 150 years of the Georgian kings, right? It has a huge amount of material there. But there is incentive to downplay. So for example, the Georgian Papers program had a blog post about William the Sailor King, right? Which was very positive about their collections and the legacies of a particular British monarch who also had ties to slavery in the Caribbean and anti-abolitionist views and scientific racism and all sorts of very negative things. But those parts of the collection are not being highlighted because that cooperation of the British royal family, and getting to have your picture taken with the Queen, right? They're very powerful incentives for a digital humanities project to want to maintain those positive options. And finally, in the case of my own lab, there are difficult questions about whether or not you should sometimes do a digital humanities project at all. And I think sometimes there's a kind of strong bias toward action in our field. Like we're makers, right? We want to make something. But sometimes really you're not in the position to be the voice for that particular community, and it's really not appropriate for you to be heading a particular project. So in closing, I kind of make an argument that we need to not occupy a position of data innocence. We need to, nobody likes to do IRBs, right? And IRBs are not enough to deal with some of the issues that I've been talking about. But I think there's a tendency to sort of think that because our objectives are positive, they're about making the public record more usable, expanding the corpus of public figures, analyzing text, not the private data of individuals, right, the output of the individual, the input. There are events in the distant past, there are no entanglements of trust and intimacy, and the tools are neutral. I don't know if we can always claim that that's true. So in closing, had a lot of talks about AI. If you want to talk to me about the MLA 4C's task force on writing an AI that I co-chaired. I'm still co-chairing. I have 2 working papers. The third one on AI literacy will be out within the month. I'm happy to talk about this too, because I think, when we talk about the ethics of digital humanities research, we also need to think about, as many other people have argued, our relationship to these powerful large language models.